nobody's written a book about Indians on Gallipoli. I'll be the first, and I was. At the time, the Indian contribution was extolled in propaganda. But since then, the big story in Indian history in the 20th century is freedom. So a group of Indians fighting for the British doesn't really fit with that picture. The British were quite careful about looking after the army that would look after them. They weren't treated in any sort of careless way. They always had the right diet. They didn't just give them bully beef and biscuit, which they did to the European troops. So there were more Indian troops on Gallipoli than anyone imagined. Half the Indian troops on Gallipoli weren't fighting troops, they were supply and transport troops. Ude Singh was involved in the terrible battle of the 4th of June when the 14 Sikhs lost 80% of their unit. One of their British officers, Reginald Savory, was wounded. Ude Singh went out and picked up Reginald Savory and brought him back to the British Indian lines.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Soldier Podcast, brought to you by Ramblings of Sikh. I'm your host, Amar Singh, and today we're diving into one of the best-known battles of World War I, the Gallipoli Campaign of 1915. Gallipoli was the first major amphibious operation in modern warfare, beginning on April 25th, 1915, and lasting until January the 9th, 1916. British Empire and French troops landed on the Ottoman-held peninsula in the Dardanelles Straits, facing disastrous consequences. Today, our focus isn't on empires, strategies, or failures. Instead, it's on the people thrown into one of history's most brutal battles. Over 16,000 soldiers served at Gallipoli, with nearly 32%, or almost 1 in 3 killed or wounded. Many never returned home, making their sacrifice a powerful yet lesser known part of this history. Today, we're lucky to have Professor Peter Stanley, one of Australia's most distinguished military historians, who has spent years in covering these hidden histories. Together, we'll uncover the hidden side of the Gallipoli story, a powerful yet often overlooked chapter in this historic battle. Before we dive in, if something grabs your attention, hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and if you're enjoying the content, consider subscribing to support the channel. Now, let's get straight into it.
One thing though that I'd love to start with is, what was the initial interest in this area? What drew you to exploring the role of Indian soldiers in this instance?
Well, Amar, when I was a teenager, when I lived in a city in provincial South Australia, I got interested in an exotic place, and that exotic place was India. And because I was inclined towards military history, I always had an interest in essentially British Indian military history, and I never lost it. And then when I started work at the Australian War Memorial, which is Australia's national military museum, one of the first things I did was to look for connections between Australia and India. And I discovered an account by a British officer who'd commanded one of the Indian mountain batteries at Anzac. And I wrote an article about it. And that was 40 years ago. And then 10 years ago, I started work at UNSW, University of New South Wales, Canberra. And I realized that because I was a research professor, I could research what I liked. And what I liked was British Indian military history. So the first thing I did, because it was 2013, it was the centenary coming up of the Great War, I thought, nobody's written a book about Indians on Gallipoli. I'll be the first. And I was. So the book you're holding is in fact still the only book. Actually, that's not quite true. There's another book coming out in India very soon. But so far, for the last 10 years, it's been the only book on Indians on Gallipoli.
Oh, that is amazing. I'm also fascinated that you've been kind of involved in this research for so long as well, which I'm sure there's just so much that we could get into. Now, just for those listening, could you provide kind of an overview of the Indian Army's involvement in World War I and specifically in Gallipoli?
Yeah, the Indian Army was quite large. It was 150,000 men in 1914. And the British regarded it as what they called an imperial reserve. They'd used Indian troops away from India, overseas, in the 19th century, but in the Great War, Indians became absolutely vital to the imperial war effort. And in fact, Indian troops left India in the very first month of the war to go to, of all places, to France, where they served for the rest of the war. And in fact, India sent away half a dozen expeditionary forces. So Force A went to France, Forces B and C went to East Africa, Force B and C went to East Africa, Force D went to Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and Force E went to Egypt. And out of Force E, they formed what became Force G, and Force G went to Gallipoli. Now, Gallipoli was a large campaign. There were hundreds of thousands of British Empire troops involved, but it was the smallest campaign for India. That might be one reason why nobody's really written much about Indians on Gallipoli. But it was the smallest of the campaigns, and it only happened in 1915. They landed in April on the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey in April 1915, and they were evacuated from Anzac and Suvla in December 1915, and the rest of the British troops were evacuated the very next month. So it was a relatively short-lived but very costly campaign, and it was one of half a dozen major campaigns fought by the Indian Army. The biggest was Mesopotamia. There were over 700,000 Indian troops in Mesopotamia. So Gallipoli with 16,000 Indian troops is relatively small.
I guess that nicely brings us on to the next question, in that why do you think then that some of these contributions of Indian soldiers, not necessarily just at Gallipoli, but just kind of during World War One in general, have either been forgotten or overlooked, or there's even from what you were just saying, it seems like there's an imbalance in the kind of attention given to some of these huge events.
Absolutely. At the time, the Indian contribution was extolled in propaganda. It was a great imperial war effort. But since then, of course, the big picture, the big story in Indian history in the 20th century is freedom, the freedom movement. So a group of Indians fighting for the British doesn't really fit with that picture. So in lots of ways, that explains why most Indians don't know about this and reasonably understandably aren't very interested. But nationalism is also important because virtually all the history that was written about the First World War for many decades was very much written in a national mould. So Australians only wrote about Gallipoli and the First World War through the lens of Anzac, the Australian-New Zealand Army Corps, the idea of Anzac. British historians tended just to look at the British Army on the Western Front. French certainly looked just at the French. There were French troops on Gallipoli, and no Frenchman has written a book about French troops on Gallipoli. So the national lens explains why people have written about the First World War. But for about the last 20 years, that's changed. And now lots of historians write what's known as transnational history. And in a sense, I'm an example of that because I'm an Australian, but I'm writing about another nation, India, and fighting in the First World War in a third place, Turkey. So transnational history is now very much the flavour in Great War history.
No, definitely. Considering then that India, even now, is obviously such a large and diverse place, how did the British Army handle such an ethnic and religiously diverse group of people? And equally, like as in just you mentioned about the propaganda of how at the time it was discussed to kind of be this great imperial triumph. Like, how did that go hand in hand with, I don't know, wooing these people? Like, as in what was the kind of the drawing force, I guess, for a lot of these troops to do what in some senses is almost against the grain of that century and what's happening in India in terms of the nationalist movement, etc.?
Yeah. Well, of course, originally it wasn't against the grain so much because the nationalist movement in the First World War at that time was quite small. It wasn't a mass movement as it became in the 30s, say. And in fact, Mohandas Gandhi, the great leader of the freedom movement, was persuaded to endorse the British war effort on the grounds that it would eventually lead to a greater measure of home rule for India. And of course, the British reneged on that undertaking, but that meant that Indian nationalists could support this imperial war because India was going to get something out of it, they thought. It didn't work out that way. And of course, the Amritsar massacre happened at the end of the Great War, and that really kicked off the 30-year struggle for freedom in a very intense way. Now, you talked about this diverse subcontinent, which had different religions, different ethnic groups. How did the British mould an imperial army from it? And there's really three ways they did it. The first way is that when the East India Company first conquered India, they very successfully brought Indians, natives as they called them, into this East India Company army. Now, I've written a book about this too, so I'm quite keen on this. But of course, that went bad. In 1857, both Hindus and Muslims rebelled against the East India Company and gave the British the biggest shock of the 19th century, of their entire rule, a great challenge to their hegemony in India. And the British learned a lesson from that. And one of the lessons they learned was that they had to be very careful to minister to and pay attention to the religious sensibilities and the ethnic sensitivities of their troops. So the Indian Army did two things. It first of all broke up the different ethnic groups into, so that no one regiment, for very few regiments, had one ethnicity in them. Actually, one of the regiments on Gallipoli was like that. We might talk about that. The 14 Sikhs were entirely Sikh. But that was quite unusual. Most Indian infantry regiments, which had 4 companies, would have a Punjabi Muslim company, as they called it, a Sikh company, a Dogra company. There would be rarely a regiment with less than 2 ethnic groups. But the most loyal and the most highly regarded martial group of the Indian Army was the Sikhs. And there were a number of purely Sikh regiments, and among them was the 14th King George's own Ferozepur Sikhs, and it was that was one of the regiments that went to Gallipoli early in 1915. So, and within those regiments, the British observed Indian religious scruples very, very carefully. So, for example, they always had the right diet. They didn't just give them bully beef and biscuit, which they did to the European troops. They made sure on Gallipoli that they had fresh meat, goats. There's photographs of Indian goat herders who were looking after the goats, which will be slaughtered in the right way, and troops will get fresh meat. Lentils, dal, all of they made chapatis. They weren't treated in any sort of careless way, and this was entirely because the British knew what had happened the last time they didn't pay attention to the religious sensibilities. So in lots of ways, the British were quite careful about looking after the army that would look after them, because they were very conscious that the army, a relatively small army, 150,000 men sounds a lot, but there were 500 million people in India. The Indian Army was one of the ways in which the British maintained their rule over India, and they knew that they needed it in order to safeguard their rule. And of course, the members of it were very proud to serve in the army. They weren't nationalists at all. Their loyalties were to the Raj, their loyalties were to their regiments, their loyalties were to their comrades. And lots of them regarded the nationalists as, ratbags, as we would say in Australia. So that changed, of course. But that's the way the British looked at this very important protector of their rule.
You mentioned the 14th Sikhs. I want to just ask you, do you mind just kind of explaining what their history and role was in general, really, and then how that ties into Gallipoli?
Yeah, look, the 14th Sikhs I found a fascinating regiment. As I say, most Indian regiments have a mixture of ethnicities in it, and the 14th Sikhs is one of less than, I think, half a dozen regiments of Indians. There were Gurkha regiments too, we might talk about them, but among Indian regiments, the Sikhs are one of the few groups who have a regiment all of their own. The Garhwals have Garhwal rifles, there's a few, but the Sikhs were the main exponent. And it's extraordinary because, of course, as you know, Amar, in the 1840s, the Sikhs fought 2 wars against the East India Company, very narrowly defeated, and were brought into the Indian Empire after bitter battles in those 2 serious wars. And then magically almost, and remember the Sikhs, you don't need to be told, your listeners don't need to be reminded, that the Sikhs were a very powerfully martial people. The victories that the British won in 1846 and 1849 were very closely fought. And you might expect that the Sikhs would be restive under British domination. They'd be resentful that they'd been conquered. And the exact opposite happened. I think because the British were so respectful of the way in which the Sikhs had fought and brought Sikhs into their army, their British Indian Army immediately. I think that reassured the Sikhs that they were respected. And that meant that the Sikhs turned from being the most bitter enemies into the most loyal guardians. So in 1857, it was in the Punjab that the British were able to ensure that they were not going to be defeated in the Great Mutiny Rebellion. And it was the Sikhs who were among the most loyal troops. And that remained for the rest of the 19th century. And in fact, the British had a crazy theory called the martial races theory, which basically said that the more west and north you went in India, the more martial, the more warlike, the more dependable and brave troops became. So troops on the northwest frontier, Pathans and Afridis, they were good. Sikhs were good. Gurkhas were good. And they started to demean and diminish the troops from, say, Madras. The troops who had in fact conquered India for them, the sepoys of Madras and Bengal, were regarded as decadent and unmanly and not worth having. So the Sikhs became one of the great exponents of British military power, and they were extolled as being one of the great martial races. And one recognition of that was to give them their own regiments. So the 14 Sikhs were formed in the immediate aftermath of, I think, the First Sikh War, remained loyal to the British in the mutiny, and then were one of the regiments that were used as this part of Imperial Reserve. So the 14 Sikhs, for example, went to China at the turn of the 19th century and were part of the suppression of the so-called Boxer Rebellion in North China. So the Sikhs became known as one of the dependable regiments. But then something strange happened that, as you know, the Ghadir movement began just in the decade before the Great War. And among the Sikhs who had prospered under British rule, the Sikh regiments were one of the very few politically aware groups in the Indian Army, and there was strong support for the Ghadir movement among the Sikh regiments, which you can imagine gave British generals some concern. However, that was a relatively fringe issue for the moment, because when the Great War came along, the 14 Sikhs and the 45th Sikhs and some of the Sikh pioneers, lots of the Sikh regiments were among those expeditionary forces that were sent overseas. Now, we talked a bit about the cultural and religious diversity. In the First World War, the enemy from October 1914 was, in fact, Ottoman Turkey, as well as Germany, the troops fighting the Germans. But there were also troops in the Middle East, in Egypt, and later in Mesopotamia, fighting the Turks. Now, of course, the Ottoman Turks were Muslim. So British generals also began to wonder about the loyalty of their Muslim troops. So the first Indian troops who were sent to Gallipoli, there was a Gurkha battalion, there was a Sikh battalion, and there were two Punjabi battalions, the 69th and the 89th Punjabis. And they had 2 companies each of Punjabi Muslimans, as they were called, Muslims from the Punjab. And after a couple of weeks, these 2 battalions were withdrawn because the general, Sir Ian Hamilton, an Indian Army general, thought that he couldn't rely upon the loyalty of these Muslim troops fighting Muslims. Now, I think that was a stitch-up. I think he was pulling someone's leg, because what his game was he really wanted more Gurkhas, because he'd been fond of Gurkhas for years. So the Muslims, the Punjabi regiments were pulled out. 2 more Gurkha battalions were sent to Gallipoli. So the force on Gallipoli, the Indian force on Gallipoli, comprised this Sikh battalion, 3 Gurkha battalions, and then more Gurkhas, and so there were no Muslim infantry on Gallipoli. But this is the important thing: the other major fighting component of the Indian troops on Gallipoli was the mountain artillery, and the mountain artillery was half Punjabi Musliman and half Sikh. So they were mixed into the batteries. They were 50% Muslim and 50% Sikh, and they performed brilliantly from the very first day of the campaign, the 25th of April 1915, right through to the 20th of December 1915. And there was not a moment when any officer, British, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, ever thought that those Muslim gunners were a worry. So I think Sir Ian Hamilton did a grave disservice to the Muslim members of the Indian Army, with who, by the way, those 2 Punjabi regiments, having been pulled out of Gallipoli because they were supposedly unreliable and disloyal, where did they go? They went to Mesopotamia. Who did they fight against? They fought against the Ottoman Turks. Did they cause any problem? No, they didn't. So, the politics of the Indian Army I find fascinating, because it's not just personal politics, it's not party politics, it's actually ethnic politics of a kind, sadly, we've come to expect and to understand in India.
You were mentioning earlier how that the Indian soldiers, when they were in Gallipoli, were kind of treated better in the sense that they were provided with fresh meat, they were provided with goats that were slaughtered in the correct ways. And even saying that, I found, searching through archives and stuff, found photos of butchers in Brighton that were set up during, I think, the First World War, the Second World, I think it was the First World War. And again, they're like, one was halal butchers, and the other one is kind of like a chatgar or a Sikh butchery almost. So I just wanted to get more of an idea about, were there other ways within which these Indian soldiers and their experiences perhaps differed from British, Australian, or other counterparts?
That's a good question, Amar, because in lots of ways the Indians, well, first of all, we don't know, because the Indian troops, by and large, mostly were illiterate. Even the ones who were illiterate used to get their comrades or their clerks to write letters to their home villages. So there are letters around. We might talk about that. But we don't really know, because those letters haven't really survived, or not ones that I've been able to read. And I don't know of many personal sources like that in India. So we don't really know, for one thing. But what we do know is that the European troops, especially the Australians and New Zealanders, they came from a country that had virtually universal education. So virtually all of them could read and write, and virtually all of them did read and write. They wrote home, they wrote letters. They also read newspapers, so they knew where they were, what they were doing. They commented on it. They'd write home. The families would send them newspapers. That wasn't the case for the Indians. And I think in lots of ways, the Indians were treated, I won't say like cannon fodder, but they were taken for granted. Their officers would say to them, "We're going to Gallipoli and we're going to fight the Turks." And they'd say, "Yes, Sab, that's what we're here for. That's what we do. We're professional soldiers. You tell us who to fight and we'll fight them." So in lots of ways, the Indians didn't have a very clear idea of what they were fighting for. They were fighting for the Sabs, they were fighting for the King Emperor, but did they know much about the politics of the war or the issues that were animating this war? I don't think so. So they saw the war often in personal terms. Their view of the war was, if you like, restricted to what they could see out of the periscope over the parapet of the trench. They could, it was a very limited understanding. And in lots of ways, they were okay with that, because that was how it always was. But it does point to a contrast between the informed and educated and literate Australian and New Zealand troops, especially, British to an extent, and to the Indians. And I think that's one of the things that marks off the two forces. Although, amazingly, they had a relationship. I mean, that's one of the most extraordinary things for me about the Indian experience of Gallipoli. Most of them, I think, most Indian troops before Gallipoli had seen European soldiers, but they'd seen them at a distance. Of all the Indian regiments, only the Gurkhas tended to believe that they were equal to the British troops. They would play football with them, for example. The Indian troops tended to keep their distance from the British because the British thought they were superior and they wouldn't mix with them anyway. They certainly couldn't drink with them. There was a cultural gulf there. But on Gallipoli, although Australia had what was known as a White Australia policy, that is to say, very few Indians were allowed to emigrate to Australia, not like today. Even though there was a White Australia policy, when the Australians got to Gallipoli and met Indian troops, rather than disdaining them and saying, "Oh, we don't want to associate with you, you wouldn't even be allowed in the country," they actually responded very warmly to them. And both sides got on. The Indians spoke, learned bits of English. The Australians learned bits of Punjabi, not much, hardly any. But with sign language and goodwill and exchanging gifts and food and things, the two sides actually formed a relationship that I find extraordinarily and in a way quite moving. Because the Australians were deeply racist people. They firmly believed that the white race was superior. And yet they were respectful towards the Indian troops that they met. And I think the answer to this is that the Indian troops often, they were professional soldiers. The Australians were amateur soldiers. When they landed on Gallipoli, they'd been in the army for less than 6 months. So they looked up to the Indians because the Indians were professionals. They were regulars. They knew what they were doing. They did it very well indeed. So they respected the Indians' professionalism. And also the Indians and non-commissioned officers, the havildars and naiks, and especially their Indian officers, the jamadars and subadars, were generally men in their 30s and 40s and even older. And I think the young Australian privates, who were no more than 25, looked up to these men as wise old soldiers. And I think that's what explains the surprising affinity that these two groups had.
I hope you're enjoying the deep dive into the role of Indian soldiers at Gallipoli. There's still a lot more to come, so if you're finding value or enjoying the conversation, make sure to subscribe and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. For those who want to go the extra mile, you can support us on Patreon or become a YouTube member to unlock early access to all future podcasts. In addition, if you're passionate about history and looking for your next great read, visit our shop at ramblingsofasikh.co.uk. Explore a collection of over 160 books and 30 comics, along with a diverse range of historical artifacts and ephemera, alongside modern day reprints. There's something for every history enthusiast. So now let's get back to the podcast.
One of the most famous Australians on Gallipoli is a fellow called John Simpson, who was a British migrant to Australia, who joined the Australian Imperial Force, the Australian Volunteer Force, thinking that he'd go back to Britain and he could see his family. And of course, he didn't go to Britain at all. They went to Gallipoli. And John Simpson was a stretcher bearer. And instead of joining with another man and carrying wounded on stretchers, John Simpson somehow collared some donkeys and used the donkeys to bring wounded men down from the firing line. Well, because he had donkeys, he would live with the Indian muleteers. The Indian mountain batteries, guns and ammunition was all carried on mules. And so he had some donkeys. Well, of course, he went to the Indian mule camp because that's where you can get fodder and water and, farriers and vets and so on. And so he lived alongside the Indians. And the food on Gallipoli, as I've said, was the European food was pretty dreadful. And lots of Australians, like Simpson, would go to the Indians and they would basically ask them for chapatis. And the Indians would make chapatis and hand them over to the Australians, and the Australians would smear butter on them, jam on them, and they'd eat, apricot jam and chapatis. And they did that because the bully beef that they were fed was so horrible in the heat of Gallipoli. But that's an indication of the kind of relationship they had, that they weren't saying, oh, we're not eating that foreign food. They really wanted the foreign food because it was better than the food they had. So you get these interesting relationships.
On the point of relationships, you mentioned how the British had a particularly interesting relationship with Indian soldiers and perhaps weren't necessarily as keen to mix with them as say, the Australians were. How did those dynamics then affect the campaign, and how did that kind of pan out in the scheme of things?
There's a kind of a romantic view of Indian troops and European officers, and the romantic view says that the Indian officer, the Indian other ranks, the other Indian soldiers, looked up to their British officers as their mother and father, ma bap, and they would be tremendously loyal, devoted, affectionate, would be devastated if they were killed, and farewelled them with heartfelt thanks when they left the regiment. And I think that's true. There was a tremendously loyal relationship. The problem is that most of the evidence about what that relationship is doesn't come from the Indians. It comes from the British officers. So the British officers are telling us that their Indian troops loved them. And that may be true. I mean, one of the most striking instances of this is that there was an Indian other rank, an Indian sepoy called Udi Singh. And Udi Singh was involved in the terrible battle of the 4th of June when the 14 Sikhs lost 80% of their unit, then killed and wounded. And one of their British officers, one of the few surviving British officers, was a young lieutenant called Reginald Savory. And Reginald Savory was wounded and was lying unconscious in no man's land, and there were bullets flying everywhere. And Udi Singh went out and picked up Reginald Savory and brought him back to the British Indian lines. And he was, in fact, he was so badly wounded, his parents were told he was dead. But he wasn't dead. He actually came back to the regiment later in the campaign. But he and Udi Singh were firm friends for the rest of their lives. Reginald Savory went on to become Adjutant General of the Indian Army in 1947, right up to independence. And he left instructions at the door of his office that if Udi Singh came in, let him in. I'd see Udi Singh anytime, he said. And on the day that Reginald Savory died, his widow, one of the first things she did was to send a telegram to Udi Singh and his family, or to Udi Singh's family in the Punjab. So you get those long and very deep relationships of affection. At the same time, Udi Singh's son wrote a little booklet about his father and this brave act that he performed. And in it, he describes one of Udi Singh's comrades saying to him, "What did you do that for? Why did you risk your life for the Saab? So, there's a little bit of ambiguity here. Now, at the same time, the regiment wouldn't have worked if they hadn't been loyal and obedient and so on. But there's another wrinkle to this, Amar, and that is of the officers in an Indian infantry battalion regiment, there were 20-odd European officers. Sorry, there weren't. There were fewer than a dozen British officers, but there were 20 Indian officers, and it's the Indian officers who are also officers. They're Jamadars and Subadars. They have command of platoons and even companies. They have responsible jobs within the battalion, but they don't write their memoirs. We don't have any of their own words. The only thing we have from them is what the British officers say about them, and they're very complimentary, of course. And just one example of how the history is hidden because there isn't enough Indian evidence. It always worried me. I didn't understand what happened to Indian dead. What happened to their bodies? They weren't buried because Sikhs don't bury their dead. They cremate them. But there's no word in the records of the British officers about cremating Indian dead. They don't write in their diary, we had 25 men killed, we cremated them. They don't talk about that. So who does that? And the answer is it's the Indian officers. The Indian officers, who of course are also Jat Sikhs, understand and are part of that culture, and it's they who are making sure that the Granth is read and the Guru is present and the proper ceremonies are held and the proper oil is put on the logs. They get the logs, they use them. It's they who are holding this unit together as an expression of Sikh culture. So I think there's more to be said about Indian officers, but because all the evidence, most of the evidence comes from the British officers, we kind of overlook them, but we shouldn't. And one day I hope a Sikh will come along and write something about Sikh, Sikh Indian officers of every ethnic type.
No, completely. I just wanted then to ask you. Obviously, there are some significant battles that involved Indian troops, such as those at Gurkha Bluff, Hill 60, and the summit of. I'm going to absolutely butcher the pronunciation.
Sari-Bayer.
Sari-Bayer? Yeah.
Sari-Bayer.
Yeah. Well, I'll take your pronunciation over mine.
Yeah. Nobody gets it right.
What goes on in these battles? How are Indian soldiers involved, and what are the outcomes? Because, for argument's sake, I think so far we've heard of kind of the 14 Sikhs. A lot of them get butchered during Gallipoli. It doesn't sound very. The outcomes don't sound that great, really. So, what is going on?
Yeah. Well, of course, remember the Gallipoli campaign was lost by the invaders, the British and the French. So they invade in April and they're forced to evacuate. They decide they can't possibly win, so they evacuate in December and January. So yeah, it was a terrible campaign, a losing campaign. Within that campaign, there are successes and failures. There are more failures than successes. Gurkha Bluff is one of the successes. In May, the 6 Gurkhas, yes, I think the 6 Gurkhas, make a very bold attack, a night attack on this dominating feature, this hill overlooking the coast in the southern part of Gallipoli called Cape Helles. And the Gurkhas take it, and they take it using exactly the tactics that they developed on the northwest frontier. The Gallipoli looks a bit like the northwest frontier. So if you can fight in the northwest frontier, you can fight on Gallipoli. And in fact, one of the reasons why I think the Gallipoli campaign failed in its opening days was that they didn't work out that if they'd used Indian troops intelligently, they could have broken through because the Indian infantry didn't arrive until the 1st of May. So Gurkha Bluff is a great success for the Gurkhas. Things don't go very well after that. The British make a series of huge attacks, both in the south and at Anzac, in the centre of the peninsula, right through May and June, and then again in August. And in the June attack, on the 4th of June, at a place called Gully Ravine, the Indian brigade advances and the Sikhs take the heaviest casualties, as you say. Nobody comes out well out of it except the Turks. They hold the line, but at massive cost to them as well. But what this has a consequence for the Indians, because the casualties among the Sikhs are so heavy that the 14 Sikhs need to be rebuilt. They need to be reinforced. Well, you can't just say, "Oh, quick, send some more Sikhs," because the nearest Sikhs of the right type, the right Jat Sikhs, are in India. So the British authorities are scrabbling to find reinforcements. And they dig up Sikhs from all over the place. So the Burma Military Police, for example, believe it or not, is a Sikh regiment, or mostly Sikh. So they draft men in from the Burma Military Police. They draft men in from other Sikh regiments in Egypt. But the main thing that they do is they say, hang on, the Maharaja of Patiala, he had a little army. He had an infantry regiment and a cavalry regiment. And because he's from Patiala, the infantry regiment, the Rajendra infantry, are all Jat Sikhs, and they're in Egypt. So they send 2 companies from the Patiala regiment, and they become part of the 14th Sikhs, because they all come from the same part of India. 14th Sikhs come from Firozpur. Patialas come from just down the road in Patiala. So there are not just Sikhs from the 14th Sikhs on Gallipoli, but there are Sikhs from the Maharaja of Patiala's little army, and they go straight into the August offensive in early August, and they fight. They're fighting for Sari Bair. Sari Bair is the dominating heights, and if the British reckon if they can capture those heights, they can break through and they can start the advance again to advance through the Turks and get to Constantinople and win the campaign. It doesn't work, of course. Only the Gurkhas get to the summit of Sari Bair, and the campaign, the offensive is a complete disaster with tens of thousands of casualties, and that's it. Except that they keep trying. So in late August, there's a fight for a tiny hillock. If you go to Gallipoli today and look for Hill 60, you can miss it because it's not much of a hill. But for a couple of weeks in the terrible summer of 1915, this became one of the focuses of the battle. Now, the really interesting thing about Hill 60 is that it wasn't just Indians, it wasn't just Australians, it was everybody. There were British troops, Welsh, there were Irish troops, there were Australians, New Zealanders, Gurkhas and Sikhs, and they were all fighting for a piece of ground which is probably smaller than a hockey pitch. It's not a big place. It's not even worth having, really, because once you capture it, the Turks are still overlooking you. So it was a completely stupid thing to do. But it's a sign, an indication of how Gallipoli really was an empire campaign, and that all of the units of the empire, all of the components of the empire, all were badly treated because they were all committed to this nutcase series of attacks. And the only thing that you can take from it is that the only good thing is that the different units from the different countries respected each other. None of them turned around and said, what can you expect? The Sikhs didn't do it. They didn't do that. They did. I mean, really, tragically, they all tried really hard and they all suffered terrible casualties. And so that was Hill 60. And after that, they held the line, and eventually in November they decided that this was a losing campaign, and in December they withdrew.
Considering you've been researching and focusing on this area for however long, what has been the most surprising or unexpected thing that you've discovered whilst researching for this book? Because, even for argument's sake, you mentioned earlier how you weren't sure, the British, when they were writing, weren't actually covering how the Indian dead were being cremated or buried. And then you've obviously dug a little bit deeper and figured out that, well, it must actually be the Sikh soldiers themselves and everything that goes with that. That, for me, is quite fascinating. But what else was there, perhaps, that you came across that made you just stop and go, this is actually unexpected?
But lots of things surprised me and pleased me in lots of ways. I mean, the first thing was that when I started this, everybody believed that only 5,000 Indian troops served on Gallipoli, which meant that they had a massive casualty rate because they lost 1,600 dead. So you think, wow, that's 1 in 3. Well, actually, when you start to look into the records, you discover that 5,000 troops went directly from India to Gallipoli, but another 10,000, 11,000 went to Gallipoli from Egypt. And in fact, there were 16,000 Indian troops on Gallipoli. So there were more Indian troops on Gallipoli than anyone imagined. But it meant that the death rate was lower. And that's partly because half the Indian troops, and we haven't talked about them today, but half the Indian troops on Gallipoli weren't fighting troops. They were supply and transport troops who didn't just supply the Indians. There were 36 Indian mule companies on Gallipoli, and each of them's got a couple of hundred mules. And they're mixed too. That there's Punjabi Muslims, there's Sikhs, and there's other ethnic groups in it too. These supply and transport troops are not making attacks. They get killed because they get shelled. There's artillery fire on them, there's snipers, there's long-range machine gun fire, but they're not making attacks. So you wouldn't expect the same casualty rate as you do, say, for the Australians, because virtually all of the Australians are frontline infantry. The supply and transport troops are really interesting too, because one of the things that really surprised me was to find this relationship between British Empire troops, white Dominion troops and Indians. And one of the most extraordinary examples of this was with a member of the Supply and Transport Corps. There was a man called Narayan Samy who was from Madras, and his job was to make barrels, because if you want to transport water, you need barrels. So he worked as a barrel maker, a cooper, in one of the Indian Mule Corps companies down on Cape Helles. And in May, some of the New Zealanders came down to Cape Helles. And one of the New Zealand battalions was commanded by a man called William Malone, who, if you go to New Zealand, William Malone is one of the names everybody knows. Everybody in Australia knows John Simpson. Everybody in New Zealand knows William Malone. And William Malone arrived in the dark, and they needed to sleep. So Colonel William Malone, crawls into a dugout, and there's a guy in a blanket there, and he says, just move over a bit, and he joins him. And when he wakes up, Colonel William Malone of the Wellington Infantry Battalion discovers that he's sharing a dugout with Narayan Samy, barrel maker from Madras. And rather than saying, what are you doing here? Get out of here, and behaving like a Saab, he treats him like a comrade. So they have a chat as much as they can. They share something, drink, but something to eat. William Malone has his photograph taken with Narayan Samy, and off he goes. William Malone's killed later in the campaign. Goodness knows what happens to Narayan Samy. I've got no idea. But for that moment, these two men from different places, different religions, different languages, different cultures, they share a moment on the Gallipoli Peninsula. And that's one of the things that I found most absorbing about the research. There were lots of things. Yeah, the Patialas. Hardly anybody knew about the Patialas. The Maharaja of Patiala's got this fantastic scrapbook which documents the Patiala's military experience. Well, no historian had looked at it before I went and was able to visit Patiala, and he said, yeah, here it is. So lots of things about the Indian experience of Gallipoli surprised me. It didn't surprise me that nobody had been interested in it, to be honest, because I knew that Indian historians 20 years ago certainly weren't interested. They're a bit more interested now. But yeah, it was one of the most satisfying bits of research I did, and certainly one of the most exciting, because I got to go to places like Gallipoli and Patiala and Nepal and Gallipoli. So yeah.
No, definitely. My last question, just to wrap up with, is that are there other lesser known aspects of military history, especially involving Indian soldiers, that you're either interested in perhaps exploring in future work, or you think someone else should at some point hopefully pick it up and kind of investigate further?
Yeah, absolutely. And both. I've done other books on British Indian history, because remember, Die in Battle came out 10 years ago, and since then I've written four more books about Indian military history. One of them, for example, was on the Santal Rebellion of 1855. The Santal Adivasi people, mostly Bengal, Jharkhand, Bihar. And in 1855, they rebelled, not so much against the British, but against the Bengali moneylenders and merchants who were oppressing them economically. But it was the East India Company Bengal Army that came and suppressed the rebellion. So nobody had written a military history of the Santal Rebellion before. So, it did that. So there are aspects of British Indian military history to be explored. But the thing that I think somebody else ought to do is something that I realized, the book that's just coming out later this year is called John Company's Armies, and it's about the Indian armies, because there were Bengal, Madras and Bombay armies in the 30 years before the Mutiny Rebellion. And I realized while I was writing it, and the big chapters, the largest groups in the Indian army, of course, are Indians. They're not the Europeans, they're the Indians. So I was able to write about them, and I realized, and I kind of knew this already from the records, the records in both New Delhi, the National Archives of India, and in the British Library in London, have massive amounts of detail, not just about Indian soldiers in the mass, but about Indian soldiers as individuals. And if you get into those records, and I've just touched, I looked at a few records for a few years, and I realized just how rich they are. And we could recover that. We could recover the names, the experiences, and even the words of Indian soldiers of all nationalities, of all ethnicities, because the records that I'm thinking of, the so-called military consultations, they go from, 1760 or something right up to the 20th century, and they're massive. I mean, there's kilometers of them. But if you pick your period and pick your focus, I think some young researcher should come along and really paint us a picture of who these men were and what their experience was, and to recover their lives, recover their personalities even. So there sure is a lot more to be said and a lot more to be researched about the history, not just the military history, but the social history of Indian soldiers of the Raj. So thanks for that question.
No, not a problem. Thank you for taking your time out to answer all of these questions. And I've absolutely enjoyed this, and I could go on for hours. I just want to check, though, is there anything in particular that you feel that we should mention or you want to include just before we wrap up? I've covered, I think, most of the questions that I wanted to, but I always just like to check before we close out.
Yeah. There is one thing, Amar, that I've realized that people assume that Indians are somehow forgotten in the commemoration of the Great War, and in a way they're right, because the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, who run all the war cemeteries around the world, British war cemeteries, they've realised that lots of Indians, although they're not commemorated, Indian dead aren't commemorated individually. And when somebody said that to me at the launch of this book 10 years ago, and I said, no. On Gallipoli, they've all got names. And if you look at the back of Die in Battle, every single Indian who died on Gallipoli or because of Gallipoli, they died in Malta and Egypt and even Britain from wounds, every single one of them is named on the memorial to the missing at Cape Helles, just like all the British troops are. So on Gallipoli and in France, Indian troops are named individually. And I assumed that was the case around the world, but actually it's not. So if you go to the memorials to the Indian dead in the biggest campaigns in the First World War, in Mesopotamia, Iraq, not that you would, but if you did, you don't see their names. What you see is the names of the British officers, you see the names of the Indian officers, and then it says, and 25 NCOs, or 25 NCOs and 261 sepoys. Just numbers, doesn't tell you names. And the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, to its very great credit, has finally cottoned on to this. And now they're making sure, they're double-checking, they're making sure that they've got the names of every single Indian who died and that those are named. So it's, now, one of the things is that who cares? 100-odd years on, do Indians care? And I think the answer is that most Indians don't know and that they don't care much, partly because these men didn't die for India, they died for the British. But I think there's a small minority of Indians who do care that the stories of Indians who fought for the British should be preserved, should be known, should be recorded. And I think that's something that even if it doesn't matter if all Indians don't care, enough to make it worthwhile. And I was certainly very, very insistent to Hellion, who were really brilliant publishers, that every single one of those names and it says where they come from, the villages they come from, and most of them, of course, most of them are Gurkhas because they were the majority, but about a quarter of them are Sikh, and all of those Sikhs who died on Gallipoli in 1915, I think it's important for Sikhs especially to remember their names and tell their stories. Thanks.
Thank you if you've made it this far. Today we delved into the lesser known story of the Indian soldiers' involvement in the Battle of Gallipoli, gaining valuable insights from military historian Professor Peter Stanley. I want to take a moment to thank Peter for making the time to join us for this conversation. Would love to have your thoughts on what we discussed, so feel free to drop a comment below. If you're listening on a podcast platform, a 5-star review would be greatly appreciated. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any future episodes, and for those who want to go the extra mile, you can support us on Patreon or become a YouTube member. Once again, thanks for tuning in, and whether it's day or night where you are, I hope you have an amazing time ahead, and we look forward to seeing you in the next one.